Santiago fell for the transfer student from class 7. He had promised to stay with me and get into the same university. But then he started skipping classes and smoking. He would run through the rain with her, laughing and carefree. When Santiago's father and uncle asked me to find him, I found him standing under a streetlight. The girl in a miniskirt across from him stood on tiptoes and kissed him lightly. She leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Santiago, will you date me?" Santiago's ears turned red on one side, and without hesitation, he nodded. I watched silently, crushing the grade report in my hand. Later, I learned that the transfer student's real purpose for getting close to him was to complete her mission. I searched for him all night in the pouring rain, frantic, only for him to casually tell me, I knew from the start, but if she failed, she would die. That's when I gave up completely. The day I decided to transfer schools, Santiago came rushing after me, throwing everything aside. He grabbed my wrist, his voice trembling, and softly begged me not to leave. Chapter 1. This was the third time Santiago had been called to the office. Rumors spread through the school. Santiago, the top student who had always ranked first, had fallen hard this time. Ever since Roxana transferred from class 7, when they said this, their gazes would constantly fall on me. In the past, the name that always appeared beside Santiago's was mine, from middle school to high school, for 5 years straight. But not once had I ever surpassed him in grades. Santiago's name was always at the top of the rankings, while mine fluctuated because of my inconsistency. The worst time, I even fell out of the top 50 in the grade. I cried about it in secret countless times. When Santiago found out, he never missed a chance to tease me. He would poke my forehead and call me a crybaby, saying I was a silly little idiot who never learned her lesson. But he would also stay up with me until 2 a.m., helping me practice. He would carefully organize the wrong answer notebook more diligently than I ever could. And every morning, he would secretly slip a bottle of warm milk into my bag. The best I ever did. I was just 0.5 points behind Santiago. He carried his backpack and held his grade report, smiling lazily. How are you still this dumb, Zoe? Even the top student in the grade is tutoring you personally. How are you not beating me yet? After teasing me, he would lower his gaze and patiently highlight the important parts for me. But all of that seems like a long time ago. Since Roxana transferred from class 7, I've never seen the Santiago I used to know. Chapter 2. Inside the office. The head teacher's reprimand continued. I lowered my gaze and saw Roxana on the playground, her ponytail bouncing as she ran quickly. She was clutching 2 pink ice creams. I froze for a moment. So that's what Santiago's unconscious doodle of an ice cream in his textbook during the last class meant. When Roxana first transferred to our school, it caused a big stir. Her dimples deepened sweetly when she smiled. And without hesitation, she stopped Santiago on his way home after school. Hey, top student, can I ask you something? Could you help me with a math problem? The very next day, the whole grade was talking about it, saying she was clearly targeting Santiago. Back then, I wasn't worried at all. Studying was the only thing Santiago and I cared about. The night my parents had their worst fight, I stood outside Santiago's house in the rain for a long time with an umbrella. When Santiago found me, I was completely soaked. At that moment, he seemed even more upset than I was. Rubbing my hair dry with a towel, he held my face in his hands, as if making a solemn promise. Zoe, we'll leave soon. We'll apply to the same university and leave the city behind. Please don't be sad anymore, okay? The sincerity in his youthful gaze felt like a vow. And under that gaze, I nodded softly. On barren land, his words made flowers bloom. Chapter 3. For the first time, Santiago fell from his spot as the top-ranked student in the grade. He often daydreamed during class, writing his single name, Roxana, in the margins of his papers. He even skipped class to watch the latest romance movie with her. Because she joked that smoking looked cool, he frowned and tried a cigarette for the first time. He was becoming less and less like the Santiago I used to know. Roxana came to our class to see Santiago again, while Santiago was called to the office. She idly flipped through his textbooks and grumbled, "This school is so full of annoying rules." But when she saw the tiny name written under his test paper, Her eyes curved into a smile. That was the first time I came face to face with Roxana. I lowered my gaze, hesitated for a long moment, and finally mustered the courage to speak. I offered to help her improve her grades if she was willing to study. Roxana froze for a moment before bursting into laughter. Her eyes blatantly scanned me up and down. Is this really about my grades? Or are you just afraid I'll take someone from you? Her words made my face burn with embarrassment. But isn't studying and getting good grades what's most important right now? Come on, Roxana laughed. But it's true, I heard that before I came along. Santiago was quite close to you. She twirled a strand of her hair. So, what do you think? Who do you think matters more to him now? I clutched the test papers tightly, but his grades have dropped drastically. Roxana tilted her head and interrupted me. I don't care. Chapter 4. Santiago's father had been worrying about his grades all day. At his request, I went to find Santiago, and by the time I did, it was already dark. Santiago was standing under the streetlight. Across from him, Roxana, dressed in a miniskirt, stood on tiptoes and kissed him lightly. She leaned close to his ear and asked, "Do you want to date me, Santiago?" Her voice was neither too loud nor too soft. Yet in the stillness of the night, it rang out clearly. I suddenly froze, my body tensing as I stared at Santiago beneath the streetlight. Not blinking, Santiago's ear turned red on one side. Without hesitation, he nodded. I do. I watched silently as they kissed under the streetlight, crushing the test paper in my hand. Chapter 5. I stood outside Santiago's house, clutching the test paper, and waited for 3 whole hours. Memories of Santiago suddenly came flooding back to me, his happy, proud, and pretend angry expressions. But it had been so long since he'd smiled at me like that. Once, I asked Santiago if he would ever date in high school. Santiago froze for a moment before tapping my forehead. What are you thinking? Focus on your studies. Stop overthinking. If you don't get into the same university as me, don't go crying about it later. After saying that, he smiled suddenly. Then, almost to himself, he muttered, "If I ever date, it'll be after a certain someone's grades are stable." As I thought about that, my eyes reddened. When Santiago returned, the corners of his lips still carried a faint, unconscious smile, but his expression froze when he saw me. "Where have you been?" I asked softly. Standing across from me, the usual carefree ease about him was gone. "Nowhere," he replied, lifting his gaze to meet mine. "Why are you here?" I didn't answer. Instead, I unfolded the test paper and held it out to him. Santiago's name was circled in red pen several times, standing out starkly on the sheet. It was at the very bottom of the rankings. The person who had once been firmly at the top of the grade had fallen so far. His fingers tightened around the test paper. I forced a playful tone. "If you need tutoring, you can always come to me, the new top student." Santiago's eyelashes quivered slightly. He didn't say a word. After a long silence, he put away the test paper and said, "It's late. Go home." As we passed each other, I suddenly asked, "Would you date someone in high school?" Santiago froze. The wind around us seemed to come to a standstill. That night, I stood there, waiting for his resolute answer. Instead, all I got was a vague goodnight. Chapter 6. Years of arguments between my parents finally came to an end. They packed their bags and decided to leave this frustrating city. "Where do you want to transfer to?" I lowered my eyes and didn't respond. "Hurry up and decide. You don't have much time to think about it." Later, I clutched my phone obsessively, calling Santiago over and over the entire day. All I heard was the cold, mechanical voice of an automated message. I wanted so badly to ask him something. Did the promise we made to go to the same university still hold? As night fell, my parents knocked on my door. "Have you made up your mind?" Before I could respond, I suddenly received a strange text message. At that moment, I learned the truth about Roxana. She was just a player in some sort of mission. Everything she did to get close to Santiago was part of her so-called quest. So that's how it was. In that instant, my first instinct was to tell Santiago right away. The rain outside poured relentlessly. The pressure to act was even heavier than the storm outside my window. My mind was in chaos, ignoring my parents' voices. I couldn't wait a second longer. I ran out into the rain. I searched for him all night in the downpour. When I finally stood, drenched from head to toe, in front of Santiago, I grabbed his wrist tightly. Do you know that Roxana had a purpose for getting close to you? I know. Before I could finish, I was abruptly interrupted. Santiago, as if he had already known, lowered his eyes and nodded. His expression was calm, even indifferent. I knew from the start. Those few words, mixed with the sound of rain, crashed down on me like thunder, leaving my mind buzzing. For a long time, I couldn't process what I'd heard. Santiago spoke softly. But if she fails, she will die. It felt like the rain had soaked into my brain, leaving me stunned. Those simple words froze me in place for what felt like an eternity. So, from the very beginning, Santiago had been willing. At that moment, I found myself remembering the night Santiago tapped my forehead and told me not to be sad, that we'd go to the same university together. That Santiago had been so impossibly gentle. But it turned out, I was the only one still clinging to the past, holding on to memories. After a long, long silence, I asked him softly, "Are you going back on your promise? The promise we made to go to the same university. Does it still count?" Santiago's face turned pale. He looked up at me, gripping his umbrella, unable to say a word. The silence stretched between us. It was only then that I noticed the pink couple's bracelet on his wrist. So, all of yesterday, he was with Roxana, while I, like an obsessive fool, called him all day. I searched for him all night in the pouring rain. Suddenly, I felt like a pathetic clown standing in front of him. Santiago was right in front of me, yet I felt like he was so far away. He was no longer the Santiago who stayed up late to teach me math. The Santiago who was afraid I'd catch a cold and kept drying my hair. He seemed to have completely disappeared. I see. I smiled at Santiago. Thank you for your answer. At that moment, my phone vibrated with an incoming call. I hung up without answering, but in my heart, I had already made my decision. There didn't seem to be anything in this city worth holding on to anymore. Chapter 7. The rain continued. The sound of raindrops hitting the umbrella grew louder and louder. It was only then that Santiago seemed to notice how drenched I was. He held the umbrella over my head, frowning. "Why didn't you bring an umbrella?" The bracelet on his wrist, wet from the rain, brushed against me, cold to the touch. I stepped back, staring at the bracelet for a long moment. "It's a pretty bracelet." Santiago froze. "A friend gave it to me." He wasn't very good at lying. He always avoided eye contact, instinctively lowering his gaze. "A girlfriend?" Under Santiago's startled gaze, I suddenly let out a small laugh. "I actually saw it. That night, under the streetlight. You and Roxana." Santiago's body stiffened, and he almost dropped the umbrella. "You don't have to hide it from me." I looked up at the boy in front of me, the one who had been there with me through countless dark nights. I told myself it didn't matter, but my nose still stung, and an unbearable ache spread through my chest. Even my voice trembled uncontrollably. "If you're honest with me, I won't cling to you." The rain continued to pour. Santiago held the umbrella over me, but he was completely soaked in the rain. "I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize." I turned around and started walking away, speaking softly but clearly. We never really had anything between us anyway. Chapter 8. The transfer happened a week later. My parents had signed the divorce papers early in the morning, each packing their things and preparing to leave. The house we had lived in for over a decade was now empty. Before leaving, they asked me one more time, "Are you sure you want to go to City A? You're not coming with either of us?" I looked up. "With who?" "With either of us." "It doesn't matter." "Then I'd rather go on my own." They nodded in unison. "Suit yourself." By the afternoon, the room had been cleared out, leaving only a single armchair in the living room. I sat in the chair, watching them quickly finish packing. No one said a word before leaving, until the door slammed shut, and the silence swallowed the house whole. It was the quiet announcement that this already broken family had finally shattered completely. Outside, the sky darkened, and the rain poured down again. I didn't turn on the lights, fumbling through the darkness. A long, long time ago, Santiago had also given me a bracelet. I remembered those nights when my parents' arguments echoed through the house. I stood in the ruins of this place, my mind blank. Through the haze, the door suddenly creaked open. Santiago, breathing heavily, froze when he saw me, then let out a sigh of relief. Zoe. He grabbed my wrist and led me outside, his breath still unsteady as he spoke. Let's go see the stars. Under the star-filled sky. Santiago didn't say comforting words. He just stayed with me, helping me endure those unbearable nights. He said that as long as he was here, he wouldn't let me face the darkness alone. No matter how hard it rained, no matter how fierce the storm, once you get used to something, it becomes a dangerous habit. When you're in the dark, you can't help but think of the light that once shone through. Curled up in the armchair, I clutched the bracelet I'd suddenly found, and in the dim room, I broke down, crying uncontrollably. Chapter 9. After that day, I fell seriously ill. When I returned to school, the rumors about Santiago and Roxana were everywhere. People looked at me with a strange sense of pity. Santiago had skipped class for her again. His textbooks were neatly arranged on his desk, with a small note tucked between the pages, catching my attention. I want to see you. Roxana's handwriting was as bold and flamboyant as she was. Next to it, Santiago's handwriting was simple, a single word, okay, for the entire class. However long it lasted, I stared at that note. After class, I unexpectedly saw Santiago's father at school. Because of Santiago's plummeting grades, his father had been called in by the homeroom teacher. When he saw me, he paused for a moment. I noticed your house was empty the other day. Are you moving? Yes. I tightened my grip on my backpack. My parents got divorced. Santiago's father's face froze. So suddenly, does Santiago know? In his memory, whenever something happened at my house, Santiago was always the first to know. In fact, he had learned everything about my family directly from Santiago. He probably doesn't know, I replied, wanting to laugh but finding I couldn't. Over the years, Santiago's father had taken such good care of me. Before leaving, I bowed deeply to him. Take care of yourself, sir. He stood there, frowning for a long time before murmuring, something this big. How could Santiago not know? Right now, he was probably next to Roxana, smiling at her. How could he notice anyone else? It's not a big deal, I said, lowering my gaze. Well, goodbye, sir. People always part ways. Parents who've been together for over a decade do. Santiago and I would be no exception. Chapter 10. The day I went back to school to pack my books, I stood on the top floor and looked down. I spent the entire afternoon quietly in this school filled with memories. The sunset that evening was breathtakingly beautiful. Santiago once said he wanted to watch 10,000 sunsets with me. So on this day, I watched the sunset for a long, long time. Santiago's desk was still empty. He had been suspended and sent home for reflection. It wasn't just me, the whole grade seemed to be in a daze. As if the boy who had always been at the top of the rankings was still here. Just yesterday. Does he know you're transferring? I was momentarily stunned, not understanding why everyone instinctively asked this question. She waved it off. No special reason. Just a feeling. It seems like Santiago really values you as a friend. Honestly, it doesn't even seem like he likes that transfer student much. We all think you're more important to him than Roxana. When you weren't at school the past few days, Santiago would unconsciously tidy your desk. He never used to zone out during class. But when you weren't here, he kept staring at your seat. Roxana got into a fight with him over this, which is how the teacher found out and sent him home. They chatted away, saying a lot of things, but beneath it all, what they really wanted to know was Santiago's reaction to my transfer. Not just her, many others wanted to see it too. I lowered my eyes and thought about Santiago's reaction. The only thing that came to mind was how he looked calm and indifferent after I'd spent a frantic night searching for him. That version of Santiago. Would he care? I couldn't tell anymore. Chapter 11. I saw Roxana again. She was standing at the school gate, still wearing the same short skirt as that night. She stood there like a proud victor, striking a pose as she looked me up and down. Stopping me, she smiled and said, "To be honest, When I first saw you, I was a little worried. After all, you're so special to him. But now that I see you're leaving, I feel relieved. I thought I should feel sad hearing this. But maybe I had grown numb at that moment. I didn't feel anything at all. Roxana looked at me with a smile. Then, as if remembering something, added, "Oh, by the way, did you get the message about the player? I saw you searching for him in the rain. You looked so pathetic. You must really like him, don't you?" She twirled a strand of her hair. "But you see, I enjoy this, taking someone away from others. It's quite the challenge, isn't it?" She smiled, her eyes curving as if she'd accomplished something extraordinary. "Is that so?" I looked at her expressionlessly and said softly, "I don't want him anymore. Anything that can be taken away was never mine to begin with. If you want him so badly, he's all yours." Roxana's smile froze on her face. She seemed frustrated, likely because she didn't see the reaction she was hoping for. Just before leaving, I turned back suddenly. "If you were really so confident, you wouldn't feel the need to show off in front of me, would you?" Her face turned pale, as if I'd struck a nerve. "They say if the mission fails, you'll disappear. Is that true?" Roxana's brows furrowed gradually, her gaze now wary. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," I said, turning away. "It's just that I haven't had the chance to tell Santiago that I'm leaving." Chapter 12. The day I left was overcast. It seemed like all my worst memories happened on overcast days. I forced myself to look up. The weather forecast said there would be heavy rain in a few hours. This city's rainy days were always so frequent. So frustrating. I stood staring blankly at the station. A smile crept onto my face. But suddenly, my nose stung. The truth was, on that rainy night, I knew exactly what I wanted. Even if Santiago had given me just one promise he wouldn't break, I might have chosen to stay. My dim life had only one ray of light shining through it. In the week I spent alone at home, I went to a bakery and picked the most expensive cake. We had agreed at the start of the year to celebrate together. I hated people who broke their promises, and I wouldn't be one myself. I lit the candles, closed my eyes, and spoke softly. "Happy birthday, Zoe. Happy birthday, Santiago." After blowing out the candles, I finished the cake alone. It was then I realized, from the moment you rely on someone else, separation becomes inevitable. In the end, the only one who will stay by your side is yourself. I clutched my phone and finally contacted Santiago. "Santiago, I've completed my transfer paperwork. I'm leaving." The moment the message was sent, my phone started ringing. I lowered my eyes and calmly pressed the button to decline the call. But the next second, it vibrated again. Just like that night when I kept calling Santiago, obsessively, again and again. I didn't answer. The moment I decided to let go, I didn't want to look back anymore. But just before boarding the bus, amidst the noise of the station, I suddenly heard a familiar voice. "Zoe!" I froze, tightening my grip on my suitcase. I didn't turn around and started walking faster. The sound of hurried footsteps behind me grew closer and closer until someone grabbed my wrist. I looked up along the hand on my wrist and saw Santiago's anxious face. The temperature was low today, but his forehead was covered in sweat. His chest heaved violently, his breathing rapid. His gaze fell on my suitcase, and as if realizing something, his face turned pale. The hand gripping my wrist tightened unconsciously, and his trembling voice asked, "Transfer? Where are you going?" I looked at him calmly, slowly pulling my hand away. Then I smiled at him and said, "Santiago, you broke your promise. So now, I'm leaving too." Santiago's eyes turned red in an instant, and even his fingertips trembled. That day, the boy who was always called a prodigy and the top student of our grade, spoke in a trembling voice, softly pleading with me, "Please don't go." I turned away without a word, pulling my suitcase. I walked away step by step. Chapter 13. The sky outside darkened once again. It seemed like rain was on its way. Since Santiago's father had left for a business trip right after the parent-teacher meeting, Santiago had been alone at home these past few days. For some reason, his mind was a mess. All he could think about was the image of Zoe, drenched from head to toe in the pouring rain that night. And her calm words, "We never really had anything between us." He couldn't shake it from his mind. How could it mean nothing? They had promised to go to the same university. Santiago suddenly came across the test paper Zoe had handed him that day. The vivid red marks jumped out at him, catching him off guard. The paper was crumpled, as if it had been clenched in someone's hand for a long time. A wave of sadness surged through Santiago, a kind of sadness and suffocation he had never felt before. All the emotions he hadn't processed at the time now overwhelmed him. How long had Zoe waited for him at the door? How long had she searched for him in the rain, alone in the dark? How could he have dismissed her with such careless words? A flash of lightning lit up the sky. Suddenly, he stood up, an unstoppable urge to find Zoe surging through him. He felt ridiculous. At that moment, he didn't care about Roxana or the so-called mission. He only wanted to tell Zoe that he wasn't going to break his promise. He didn't want to break his promise. His falling grades didn't matter. He could catch up any time he wanted. Santiago tried to steady his breathing as he rummaged through his closet for an umbrella. But just as he stepped out the door, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He froze when he saw the contact name Silly Goose on the screen. His hands trembled as he opened the message. It was just 3 short sentences. Yet Santiago stared at them for minutes. Santiago, I've completed my transfer paperwork. I'm leaving. Chapter 14. A deafening clap of thunder. The rain poured down. Before Santiago could even open his umbrella, his shoulder was already soaked. His face was deathly pale. The usually top-ranked student in the grade now found himself unable to comprehend these simple sentences. He raised his hand to shield the screen, his trembling fingers typing out a reply. What do you mean? Where are you going? Santiago stood in the rain, waiting for an answer, but none came. He tossed his umbrella aside and ran into the downpour. He headed straight for Zoe's house, the path so familiar he could walk it with his eyes closed. Yet, when he stood at the empty doorway, he wished for the first time that he had taken the wrong route. The door was ajar, and everything inside had already been cleared out. When did this happen? Was it another argument? Or had something more serious occurred? He knew nothing. Santiago's eyes reddened. Without hesitation, he turned and started toward the station. On the way, Santiago kept dialing Zoe's number. After each ring, the same cold, mechanical voice responded. He refused to give up, obsessively redialing, again and again. Not a single call went through. In the end, his trembling hands typed out a message to her. Please, answer the phone. Chapter 15. The station was crowded with people, a sea of moving bodies. Santiago weaved through them, unable to stop for even a second. He had never imagined that Zoe would leave, so when she pried his fingers away, one by one, and smiled as she said she was leaving, his mind went blank. He didn't even think to grab her again, but maybe he couldn't have stopped her anyway. He could only watch as Zoe's figure melted into the crowd, until she was completely out of sight. He sat frozen at the station for a long time, as if on autopilot. He found himself back at Zoe's house, although now, it could no longer be called a home. It was far too empty. Santiago stood in the vacant room for a long time, from dawn until dusk. Occasionally, passing neighbors recognized him as someone who used to visit Zoe often and asked curiously, "They moved out a while ago, didn't you know?" Santiago shook his head, dazed. The neighbor looked even more puzzled. "Didn't you celebrate your birthday with Zoe? Just a few days ago, I saw her buy a cake. In her room. She wished both herself and you a happy birthday. Strange. If you weren't there, who was she talking to?" The neighbor trailed off, noticing how pale Santiago's face had become, and quickly left. Santiago staggered, his body swaying as if he could barely stand. Their birthdays were far apart. At the start of the year, Santiago had asked if they could celebrate together this time. Zoe hadn't hesitated for a second before agreeing. She nodded firmly. "Then neither of us can break our promise, okay?" That memory now felt like a blade, sharp and unrelenting, stabbing directly into Santiago's chest. The tightly wound thread within him suddenly snapped. In the empty room, he searched desperately, frantically, hoping to find something. Finally, He spotted a piece of paper and a bracelet on the windowsill. Santiago picked up the bracelet. The paper bore no message, only a few lines of lyrics. The forever we promised has broken apart. The unchanging hope has all changed. Only with closed eyes can I still see the once warm and vibrant memories. The paper was crumpled, as if it had been soaked and dried multiple times. Santiago's hands trembled as he held it, his gaze downcast. He couldn't bear to imagine Zoe sitting alone in this room, writing these lyrics. The mere thought brought an overwhelming wave of suffocation. He had never felt such fear before. I'm sorry. In the dim room, the boy broke down completely, his sobs echoing in the empty space. Chapter 16. When the system warning alarm blared, Roxana was still brainstorming ways to accelerate her progress. Lately, no matter what she did, her progress had completely stalled. She was starting to feel anxious, until the sudden, sharp sound of the system alarm startled her. Warning! Strategy affection value is dropping rapidly. Repeating. Strategy affection value is dropping rapidly. Roxana abruptly sat up, staring in horror as the affection value on the system panel plummeted in a straight line. Finally, it hit 0. What's happening? All my effort. Her eyes widened. Santiago, what happened to him? Roxana grabbed her umbrella and sprinted to Santiago's house. But he wasn't there. Almost instinctively, she turned and ran toward Zoe's house. On the way, she suddenly recalled Zoe's soft-spoken words at the school gate. I heard if the strategy fails, you'll disappear. Is that true? Roxana panicked, stumbling over her own feet. Everything she had done was to force Zoe to leave. Now that Zoe was gone, the strategy should have been smooth sailing. So why did the affection value disappear in an instant? A horrifying thought crept into her mind. It can't be, she muttered. I won't fail. Chapter 17. Roxana stopped at the doorway. She stood there, looking at Santiago sitting silently in the empty room. It was a Santiago she had never seen before. He lifted his head and glanced at Roxana, but said nothing. He simply sat there, staring quietly at the piece of paper on the windowsill. No matter what Roxana said, no matter how much noise she made, he didn't respond. He was entirely immersed in his own world. Santiago. What's wrong? Roxana's voice cracked with tears. Don't ignore me. But Santiago's face grew even paler, as if her presence had triggered some thought he couldn't bear. Just as Roxana was about to leave, Santiago finally spoke. He looked at her, his voice calm. I really regret it. From now on, don't come looking for me. I hate myself, and I don't like you. Roxana completely lost her composure. Then what about me? What am I supposed to do? The consequences of a failed strategy were something she couldn't bear. Her only answer was silence. No matter what she said or did, the affection value remained as still as water. There was no progress anymore. Chapter 18. Zoe moved away. She transferred schools. Santiago seemed to suddenly grow silent. The only question he asked repeatedly was whether anyone knew where Zoe had transferred to. But no one in the class could answer him. He started visiting that empty house more and more, as if, long ago, he could still push open the door and softly ask, Zoe, do you want to watch the stars? The quiet house sat still in the dim light. The boy waited for a long time, but no answer came. He stood there, staring blankly at the door he knew so well, every detail etched into his memory. At that moment, he finally understood. The girl who had accompanied him through countless nights and days had truly, completely left his world. Chapter 19. After transferring to City A, I struggled with insomnia for a while. The girl who used to sit behind me often sent me updates about the school gossip. Most of it was about Santiago. Ever since I left, he hadn't come to school for several days. She said it felt like Santiago had completely changed. Eventually, his relationship with Roxana fell apart. Roxana kept coming to their class to find him, but he wouldn't say a single word to her. The question he asked the most was if anyone knew where I had transferred to. And recently, he has started studying again. She mentioned this with a hint of admiration in her voice. The top student really is a top student. He's climbed back to the #1 spot in the grade. I interrupted her. Thank you. But please don't tell me anything about him anymore. I don't want to know. He doesn't have anything to do with me anymore." After a moment of silence, she sent another message. "He's been asking about your whereabouts again these past few days. Should I tell him?" I held my phone for a long time, staring at the screen, before slowly typing out a reply. "No, don't." Chapter 20. City A was far from here, with only one distant relative nearby. I rented an apartment close to the school and stayed in the dorms during the week. In this unfamiliar environment, I threw myself entirely into my studies. 2 months after transferring, I successfully claimed the top spot in the grade. Many classmates came to congratulate me, and even the teacher said their class now had the grade's top student parachuted in. I stared at the report card, feeling like I finally had something to be happy about. Everything gradually fell into place, smooth and uneventful, until rumors started spreading at school about a handsome guy who showed up near the school gates every week. He always said he was waiting for someone, but no one had seen who he was waiting for. A lot of people started gathering at the gates on Saturdays to see him out of curiosity. I couldn't bring myself to care, especially since the weather was getting colder. Sometimes I didn't even want to return to my rented apartment on weekends. I'd just stay in the dorm, reading. Occasionally, my roommates would return excitedly after spotting him. "Today's so cold, but that guy's here again. I saw him too. How many times has he shown up? Who's he even waiting for?" One girl wrapped in her blanket sighed. "I don't know. I just know it's freezing outside. Standing there for a few minutes would leave you frozen stiff. And they say he's from City S. That's really far from City A." I kept my eyes on my book, my mind wandering for a moment. Chapter 21. After another exam, I remained firmly in first place. That day, the first snow of the season fell. I was at the school gate, standing amidst the crowd. When I looked up, I suddenly met a pair of familiar eyes. The feeling was so overwhelming, so familiar, that I instinctively held my breath for a moment. The snow fell softly, a thin layer already covering the ground. It crunched beneath every step. Santiago stood there in the snow, his gaze fixed on me from a distance. His eyes seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. For a few seconds, our eyes met in the air before I calmly looked away. My roommate whispered next to me, "Did you see him? Isn't he so handsome?" I nodded slightly, saying nothing. Santiago didn't move or try to approach me. He stayed where he was, the corners of his mouth lifting faintly. It looked like he was smiling. Chapter 22. The moment they mentioned City S, I already knew it had to be Santiago. I just didn't know how he managed to find the city. But no matter how he found it, it no longer had anything to do with me. After finally escaping the whirlpool of pain, there was no reason to look back. Still, thinking about those times, I couldn't help but feel my eyes grow red. I shook my head, forcing myself to suppress the surge of emotions. No matter what Santiago did, it had nothing to do with me. Santiago never approached me to talk. He didn't do anything, really, just showed up at the same time every week. If we happened to cross paths, he would simply look at me quietly. If we didn't, he showed no reaction. Only the indifference in his expressions seemed to deepen. Until my birthday, I heard Santiago had been seen holding a cake box, sitting not far from the school, waiting from morning until night. Apparently, he was keeping an appointment. During a full day of classes, I kept staring out the window at the snowstorm, lost in thought. In the end, I decided to go out and meet him. Some things needed to be said face to face, but Santiago spoke first, beating me to it, perhaps from being outside too long. His voice was hoarse. "Happy birthday," he said, looking at me with a faint smile. This time, I kept my promise. Maybe it was just the cold weather, but my throat felt tight. I looked at him, unable to speak. Santiago lit the candles. The faint light flickered in the dark night. Holding the cake, Santiago's eyes reflected the dancing flames. In a soft voice, he said, "Happy birthday, Zoe." Then, he added in an even quieter voice, "Happy birthday, Santiago." Chapter 23. I thought that after so much time, even if I saw Santiago again, it wouldn't stir much emotion. But emotions built over years can't be erased in just a few months. I thought about it. And I need to make things clear with you. I know. Before I could finish, Santiago interrupted me. I know what you're going to say. Santiago had always been perceptive. His voice seemed to catch slightly. I just, really wanted to see you. How have you been, lately? I've been fine. How are your grades? They're good too. That's good. Santiago lowered his head, remaining silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy, as if he didn't know whether he was asking me or himself. How did things come to this? I didn't say anything, quietly watching the candle burn down to its final moments. The atmosphere fell into a deep silence. After a while, I rubbed my chilled hands and said, "It's getting late. You should go home." As we brushed past each other, Santiago suddenly reached out and grabbed my wrist. He seemed to be holding back something, his voice trembling. "Could you not leave? The promise we made to go to the same university, does it still count?" That one sentence pulled me back to that night I had been trying so hard not to remember. With my back to him, I sniffed quietly and replied with a deliberately evasive good night. Chapter 24. The college entrance exams were drawing closer, and the countdown had begun. The person at the school gates remained steadfast. Rain or shine, I had no time to care about him. Everything that needed to be said had already been made clear. I was painfully aware that, no matter what, I couldn't place my hopes on anyone again. Behind any seeming salvation might lie an abyss that could lead to utter ruin. I didn't want to gamble again. I couldn't. What I hadn't expected, however, was for Roxana to come looking for me. She was bundled up in a thick winter coat, her face pale as she grabbed onto my sleeve. "Please, I'm begging you, don't take him away from me." I stood still, staring at her, a bit bewildered. This Roxana bore no trace of the arrogant girl she once was. "Can't you just completely leave his world? You know, if I fail the strategy, I'll die. I'll be erased by the system. I don't have much time left." "Oh." I nodded indifferently, my tone casual. "But I don't care. You enjoy taking things from others, don't you? Why not try a few more times?" Perhaps Roxana had truly run out of options. Even when faced with such words, she didn't retaliate. Instead, her eyes filled with tears. I was wrong. I really was. I shouldn't have chosen Santiago as my target. I just thought he was handsome. I acted on impulse. "Santiago listens to you the most. Could you convince him to like me?" I froze, stunned into silence by her words. It took me a long moment before I managed to speak. "So everything was just because of a fleeting whim of yours?" "I know I was wrong. I'm repenting. Could you please just talk to him?" She had tried everything to increase his affection level, but nothing worked. She was truly terrified. She didn't want to disappear. One by one, I pried her fingers off my sleeve. "If that's the case, Roxana, you really deserve to die." Roxana froze. I stared at her, my face devoid of emotion. "I'll wait for the day you're erased. I'm honestly looking forward to it." For a second, Roxana seemed too stunned to react. Then she erupted into a stream of curses. No, it won't happen." She kept shaking her head. "I won't fail. He was so close to liking me. Zoe, it must be you. You're the one ruining this." I ignored her hysterical ranting and turned back into the school. Chapter 25. The college entrance exams in June came with heavy rain. With the final clap of thunder, my high school life officially came to an end. Surprisingly, I didn't feel relieved. I thought it was because I was worried about my results. But even when the acceptance letter arrived, I still didn't feel any joy. I realized there wasn't anything that could make me happy anymore. The moment I received the news, I didn't even know who to share it with. I lay in my rented room, listening to nothing but the cicadas outside. I stayed like that, quietly zoning out for a long time. In a daze, I recalled a summer long ago, a scorching afternoon, Santiago's smiling face. He held a test paper in one hand and lightly tapped my forehead with the other. "Zoe, why can't you just learn this? When the results come out, don't cry. I won't comfort you again. This time, I mean it." I hugged my pillow and turned over. I pressed those memories deep into my heart. When I woke up in the evening, I gathered everything related to Santiago and packed it into a single box. I locked it. When I stepped outside, I gently tossed the key into the air. It arced across the sky before sinking into the bottom of the lake. Goodbye. I mouthed the words silently. Santiago. Roxana's perspective. Ever since her last trip to City A to find Zoe, Roxana had refused to give up and tried everything she could. But Roxana was exhausted. After all this effort, Santiago remained like a completely lifeless mountain. As she spiraled into growing panic, the thing she feared most finally happened. Strategy failed. You are about to be erased by the system. The cold system voice suddenly rang in her mind. Roxana's face turned ashen in an instant. No, no. Give me more time. I'm so close to succeeding. Santiago clearly likes me, she screamed, her voice breaking into desperate cries. But nothing could stop her body from slowly fading away. Roxana clutched her head, finally breaking down into sobs. I was so close to succeeding. How could Santiago not like? Her voice gradually faded, her horrified gaze fixed on the void. And then, her body vanished completely, leaving no trace behind. Strategy failed. Clearing in progress. Clearing complete. Santiago's perspective. Chapter 1. The summer after the college entrance exams, Santiago made countless trips to City A, hoping to find out which university Zoe had applied to. But even when the admission letters arrived, he still didn't dare approach her. That evening, Santiago saw Zoe standing by the lake. She held a key in her hand. She stared at the key, rubbing it between her fingers for a long time. Finally, she raised her hand and threw it. At its peak, the key fell, sinking straight to the bottom of the lake. It felt like Santiago's heart sank along with it. Perhaps others wouldn't know what the key represented, but no one understood it better than Santiago. Zoe had once told him that when she made up her mind to let go of something completely, she would throw away a key. Zoe had truly decided to forget him. At that moment, Santiago knew this day would come, but he still couldn't accept it. He stood silently at a distance, staring at the spot where the key had sunk, lost in thought for a long time. Something inside him felt like it was slowly unraveling. It hurt so much he could barely breathe. He always thought, if only he hadn't messed things up. But life doesn't give you that many what-ifs. Chapter 2. Over the years, Santiago often snuck onto Zoe's university campus. He had found out where she went to school. Zoe seemed to have truly moved on. She had regained her old smile. She worked hard to make her life lighter and happier. Santiago was genuinely happy for her, but he was also deeply sad for himself. He couldn't let go, but he no longer had any reason to get closer to her. All he could do was watch her from places where she couldn't see him. He wished her peace and success, health and joy. Beyond that, there was nothing else he could do. Lately, he had been dreaming frequently, always about the past. Before Zoe was angry with him, she would always tilt her head and tease him. Hey, you're the top student in the grade, and yet you still can't teach me? This is your fault. You need to reflect on yourself. Do you hear me? Yes. Yes. Santiago would always nod, lazy yet serious in his response. I hear you. Both ears heard you loud and clear.